The internal rate is our fourth and final tool that we're going to use to analyze data and try to determine whether we should make a capital investment decision. And the internal rate of return is a rate of return that's based on, once again, discounted cash flows in your capital investment. But it is a little different than our accounting rate of return in that it is the interest rate. So what we're looking for our internal rate of return is we are actually calculating this rate, and it is the rate that is going to make, careful here, the net present value of our investment equal to zero. So we're looking at when my initial investment of $1 million or whatever it happens to be for this acquisition is equal to the present value of my net cash inflows. So what I want to know at the internal rate of return is what is the rate of return that is required to make my initial investment equal to the cash flows, equal to zero, so that I know that I cannot go below that rate of return. So what we know with the net present value method that we just reviewed is that either we have a positive net present value or not. If it is positive, we know that we have exceeded the minimum rate of return that was required by our organization, 14% in the Smart Learning illustration, but we don't know what the actual rate of return was on the project. All we know is that we exceeded the minimum that was required by our organization. So the internal rate of return breaks this down and gives us a little more detail so we can see at this rate of return, we are actually breaking even with our investment. So with, for example, if we have Smart Touch Learning's laptop project, remember they invested $1 million into their project and they were anticipating cash flows of $305,450 every year for 5 years. And so once again, what I'm trying to identify here is the interest rate. And so we use our same formulas that we were using before to calculate the numbers that we were using from the tables to calculate present value of lump sums or annuities. But here, my unknown is actually the interest rate. So if we begin to plug in our figures, we find that the initial investment was $1 million. We know that. And our initial investment divided by the amount of cash inflows for each year was $305,450. And we come up with an annuity factor of 3.274. So if you remember what happened before is I have a $305,000 annuity and I'm trying to bring it to its present value over 5 years with a particular rate. And so instead of multiplying the 305,000 times a rate to come up with our initial investment, now we are trying to solve for that rate. So now I've simply revised the formula. Instead of saying 305,000 times a factor, I am trying to actually find that factor. So we've reversed our formula. And when we find our annuity factor of 3.274, we go to our annuity, because we know this is annuity, $305,450 for once a year for 5 years. I go to my annuity table and I look for this factor, 3.274. So when I look in the annuity table at 5 years, and I skim across the 5-year data looking for this factor, I find the 16% interest rate. So it tells me that at a 16% interest rate, the net present value of this investment would be zero. And you could plug this number in if you wanted to see that it works. And your book actually does this for you and gives you an illustration of modifying these formulas. So I'd encourage you to get there. It's on page 1455. And so you can see the rearrangement of the formula. You can see the identification of the annuity factor and the 16% interest rate actually used in the formula to come up with a zero net present value. Okay, so I'm not going to put all that on the screen, but you're certainly more than welcome, and I highly recommend you to go to this page in your text and take a look at this information. But what I want you to know from this information is we are trying to discern the internal rate of return that would cause your initial investment of 1 million to equal the present value of your cash inflows at 1 million. Okay? So once we figured out that this is 16%, if my minimum rate of return required by my organization was 14%, and we know that 16% will generate zero present value, then yes, our internal rate of return meets or exceeds what was required, and this would be one of those projects that would make it through our filter or make it through our screen to the next rationing process. Now, this is a little more complicated, and let me back up here. In this particular situation, we were able to go straight to the tables and find the 3.274 factor. Sometimes it won't be quite that easy, but I'm not going to ask you to do interpolations in this class. You can do that in finance. But sometimes you may find that the number is somewhere between 15% and 17%, or between 16% and 17%. And we would have to do an interpolation to find the exact rate, or use your business financial calculator to do that. I simply want you to know about the internal rate of return is that we are trying to identify the interest rate, the internal rate of return that would make my net present value of the cash flows equal exactly the amount of investment that we have incurred for this capital investment project. Okay, so what happens if we have unequal cash flows? Okay, such as in our second project with 500, 350, 300, 250, then it's a little more complicated. Then the process doesn't work, quite as easily as working through our formulas here. But what your book tells you, so you can see that we would use trial and error per se. And so I know that with a present value factor, here they have started with 16%. But if you can recall, when we were calculating the net present value, we were using a minimum rate of return of 14%, and this was generating positive net present value. So if we're trying to determine an internal rate of return for unequal periodic values, we can't simply divide the present value by our investment. Now I have to use trial and error, but I know that that rate should be somewhere above 14%. So I can plug in 16%. When I plug in the 16% factor and calculate the present value of my project, it is still above the initial investment. So the present value of my inflow still does not equal my initial investment. I still have a positive present value. If that's the case, I know that we're generating a higher return. So let's try. Let's try again. Once again, as I mentioned, this is trial and error. So if we try again with an 18% interest rate, once again, I calculate all the present values using 18%. I compare those cash flows to my initial investment of 1 million, and it's 3,980. So I know at this point that my internal rate of return is somewhere slightly above the 18% factor. And once again, this was simply by trial and error. But if I know that my minimum required rate of return is 14, and I'm generating at 18%, I'm still generating more return than just my investment, that my rate of return certainly has to be greater than 14%. So basically what I'm trying to do is figure out what is the internal rate of return that I need for my the net present value of my cash inflows. What internal rate of return do I need the present value of those inflows to be to exactly cover my initial investment? And then I can determine that anything above that may be acceptable and anything below it is not. Now, this table that is provided for you in the slide does give you kind of a summary of the different methods that we've talked about: the payback, the accounting rate of return, net present value, internal rate of return. So remember, on payback, I simply want to know how much time is it going to take me to recover my investment. The accounting rate of return is simply looking at how is this impacting my operating income. So with the investment that I'm making, how am I utilizing that investment to generate operating income? The net present value allows us to go back and look at the difference of the present value of my cash flows and my initial investment, bringing all of those cash inflow and outflow amounts to a present value calculation so that I'm comparing apples to apples and oranges to oranges. And the internal rate of return is basically helping us to determine what is the minimum rate of return that is required for the present value of my cash flows to cover my investment. And they each have their strengths and they each have their weaknesses. And so this just goes to show us that we can use any one or any combination of these tools in our decisions, but for the most part, the payback and the accounting rate of return are the simplest measures that we can utilize, but they do, as the text says here, they do ignore the time value of money. So they may be good screening tools for us to determine which projects get to move to net present value or the internal rate of return test. Now, also realize that if you're using the net present value, that you may have to take into consideration a profitability index if you have assets that have different initial investments. And with our internal rate of return, it is difficult sometimes to calculate this accurately if you don't have a business calculator or computer software immediately available. But it is probably one of the most detailed cash flows that we can do, and it helps us to actually compute and capture what our actual unique rate of return is on this particular project. Okay, so one of the things that you should walk away from this topic is that there are a lot of calculations in these formulas, but it's not likely that you're going to be sitting around with your calculator manually calculating out the present value or the internal rate of return of a project. You're going to be able to use Excel or Access or your database or some software to be able to do this for you. And the good thing about using Microsoft Excel to make these calculations is that we can use it to perform sensitivity analysis or what if. So what if the number of years of inflows changes? What if the interest rate changes? And so we see an example somewhat of a sensitivity analysis in this screen, simply showing us the useful life of 5 years, our anticipated minimum return of 14%. And so we can simply plug in the numbers that we need in an Excel calculation to generate the net present value of these two different projects and to calculate the internal rate of return on each. And the next slide shows us that we have our calculations set up for our totals and set up for the net present value and internal rate of return calculations. But what if I can change the useful life? I can change the discount rate. I can change the amount. What happens if the amount of cash flows change, from 1 year to the next? What if it's no longer a consistent annuity, but it's different amounts over time? So we can change any of these factors. We can change our initial investment. And so changing any of these factors immediately at your fingertips generates a new calculation for you. So just beware of utilizing the tools in Excel to calculate formulas such as this. And I have actually provided a link to a YouTube video that will show you how to set up some of these tools in Excel. If you're interested, please feel free to take a look at that video. It takes about 10 minutes, but you can skim through and look at whatever parts of it that you think might be most important to you. So finally, with all of the tools that we have used, remember we mentioned capital rationing. Well, if we start with our payback and our accounting rate of return criteria, if for some reason the investment that we're considering does not, the payback period is too long or the accounting rate of return is too low, then do we automatically just ditch this potential investment decision? Not necessarily, okay, but we want to go back and look at the qualitative. Are there some qualitative factors that we haven't considered that might be important? If they are, and for some reason, even though it didn't meet our payback or accounting rate of return, because there are qualitative factors, we can move it back into the mix. So once we move it back into the mix, we want to determine if it meets the net present value or the internal rate of return criteria. If they do not, Once again, were there qualitative factors that would have made us say yes to this project? If so, let's move it back into our project ranking. But we're going to, if it did meet our requirement for present value and internal rate of return, then let's look at the qualitative factors for moving ahead. And there may be some qualitative factors that say, hey, even though it meets these factors, there are some ethical issues or quality issues that we just can't manage at this time. Let's still reject this project. Okay, so we're not finished. It's not certain that we would pursue a project just because it does meet the net present value and internal rate of return criteria. But if it does, and the qualitative factors are there, and they would not change our mind, then let's move ahead. And we can rank the projects now. The ones that have made it through our list, we can rank them. And it's nice that we have them ranked, but if we have a certain limited amount of funds, we have to decide which of these investment decisions or projects can we move forward with, and which do we have to say no to at this point, but possibly reconsider if funding becomes available in the future, or if other circumstances happen to occur or take place that would cause us to reconsider. But document this information, document what has taken place, what analysis has taken place, and how your project has even gotten into the ranking position, so that you have some understanding about the project if you do have to go back and reconsider. Okay, so some interesting information in Chapter 26 talking about capital investment decisions. And I just want you to be aware that there are multiple ways that we can identify whether to pursue capital investment decisions, and there's no one tool that is a standalone foolproof answer to tell us what we need to know. But any combination of these tools can give us the quantitative data that we need to begin to make a more thorough analysis, considering those other qualitative decisions about which of these investment decisions that truly impact the long-term goals and strategic objectives of our organizations, which ones do we truly need to acquire and put into use. So I hope you have gathered some useful tools from this chapter that you can use to make such decisions.